Next to the US border crisis, one of the top things in people's minds are our elections free and fair? Also, are we being censored by our own government? If you live in Brazil, the answer is yes. If you live in the United States, I don't know. That's why I have special guest Mike Benz with me. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, just some background on you. You're a former State Department official with the Trump administration, cybersecurity expert. You've been interviewed by Vivek Ramaswamy, Tucker Carlson. I believe you just crossed 34 million views on that. What I want to know as somebody who specializes in cyber. Help my audience understand how the government is being weaponized against us and specifically against conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, this basically, the story here is about the US government's foreign policy establishment turning the powers that it has to be able to control media abroad basically towards the citizens of the homeland. So we in the US, since World War II, have had a foreign policy establishment deputized with a Department of Dirty Tricks power to be able to do things to foreign governments and foreign citizens that they're not allowed to do to our own citizens, because ostensibly it's for the benefit of us living here. For example, the Central Intelligence Agency has a power to overthrow governments, to bribe foreign media organizations, to set up its own media organizations. This is a power they've had for a very long time. There was Wisner's Wurlitzer, so-called in the 1940s and 50s, which Frank Wisner got, sort of godfather of the CIA, bragging that there were 800 different proprietary news outlets that the Central Intelligence Agency was able to play like a Wurlitzer, like an organ, to create a symphony of news cycles in whatever region of the globe they wanted to pipe in. We established things like Voice of America, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, to have, State Department and CIA news propaganda piped into other countries around the world. And it's the job of the US State Department to essentially put its thumb on the press of every election around the world so that the right parties rise to power to advance US national interests, so that we can pry open their markets, so that our companies, so that Coke and Pepsi can export there, so that we can have our own oil and gas companies, exploit the shale in the region. Same thing, with the rare earth minerals, with the precious metals, with the copper, the aluminum. Everything that it takes to make a modern economy requires the plots of dirt that exist, primarily outside the U.S. So we have this empire managerial class in this country. The Pentagon, the State Department, and our intelligence services. They face outside. They're not supposed to face in. And they're deputized to be able to do these nasty things to foreign countries for the greater good, essentially, of the Americans who live here, so that we have cheap gas, so that we have lots of jobs, because our multinational companies have favorable operating conditions because foreign governments essentially do their bidding, because they can sick the State Department and Pentagon and CIA on them, essentially. The issue is the 2016 election created a crisis in the foreign policy establishment. Now, it goes back a little bit before that. Really, this goes back to the Crimea annexation and the State Department orchestrated overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014. The State Department, the CIA, the DOD, all backed the Maidan coup against the Ukrainian government, but they were not expecting the counter coup when the Donbass broke away in eastern Ukraine and Crimea broke away and declared itself in a referendum voted for by its own people to join the Russian Federation. NATO was not prepared for that counter coup. And at that point, despite piping $5 billion worth of US taxpayer money into Ukrainian CIA and State Department cutouts, it was still not enough to sway the hearts and minds of people in eastern Ukraine to join NATO rather than to join Russia. And this was also a pattern that was playing out across Central and Eastern Europe, from Germany through Moldova, through Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. In 2014, NATO declared a basically new doctrine called the hybrid warfare doctrine that basically said control over the media is now a very important military concern. because the media determines elections. Elections determine the military posture of a country. And so basically, the military needs to make a much stronger move into the media. And that was something that was not all that controversial at the time in the United States because it was Central and Eastern Europe. It was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Germany, who was the central pivot point of the Cold War. If you recall the sort of spy versus spy of control over Germany. The issue was when Brexit happened in June 2016, Western Europe then became, the threat was now the hybrid warfare doctrine has to extend into Western Europe. And then when Trump won the 2016 election in November 2016, it became a sort of fait accompli that the US government needed to move into control over social media because now elections were being determined not by legacy media outlets picking the winners and losers, but those legacy media outlets having essentially a backdoor relationship with the intelligence services, with the State Department, with the Pentagon. And I can go over the history of that if you're curious. But essentially what happened was there's two things that determine news. There's propaganda, there's saturation of our message, and there's censorship, which is the suppression of counter messages. When the power for censorship was discovered, essentially in 2016, 2017, through the use of artificial intelligence technology like natural language processing, these AI censorship techniques, and the ability to just hire tons and tons and tons of these content moderators, especially starting in Europe, where it was not all that controversial because they don't have a First Amendment. The foreign policy establishment established a plan to basically create a censorship center, nerve center within the United States to be able to quarterback censorship, to stop the rise of populist political movements all across NATO. Here in the US with the Trump movement, also with the Bernie Sanders left in 2016, because left-wing anti-imperialism is also something that's, they can be flanked from both the right and the left, but the populist right has been much more ascendant electorally. But basically, this censorship, this government censorship apparatus was installed by the foreign policy establishment to stop Trumpism in the U.S., to stop the Brexit folks in the U.K., to stop Marine Le Pen in France, to stop Matteo Salvini in Italy, to stop the Vox Party in Spain. It's all across NATO. And the issue is they thought that if they continued to lose elections, the entire international rules-based order would fall apart. And so it became a national security imperative to kill free speech on the internet.
Wow.
And I can go through the chronology if you want of
like,
agency by agency, how this all happened, if you want.
Yeah, my brain is trying to understand all of this because, as I've covered the Russia-Ukraine war, I've seen more and more how the United States uses NATO to really control these other European countries. But the infiltration through social media companies, this is new to me. Yes, I would love from myself and the audience to better understand the chronology of that.
Right. So what they wanted was an ability to kill social media parties and social media movements and proxies for their populist opposition on these social media platforms. And at the time, coming into the 2016 election here in the US, there was really only one government agency that had a license to do something similar. And that was something called the Global Engagement Center out of the State Department. So again, the job of the State Department is to rule the rest of the world. That is so again, when you think about the State Department, always think about the interagency. The State Department is inseparable from the CIA. It's inseparable from the DoD. Those three nodes always move together. They're coordinated through an interagency process. And so because the State Department, the ambassador there and the senior staff for the desk of a particular region, they represent the overt side of U.S. diplomacy. They're the ones who are doing the negotiations. They're the ones who are sending a delegation to threaten the foreign government or to offer incentives to the foreign government. They're the ones, that's the overside of the iceberg, so to speak, our overt diplomacy. But we have covert diplomacy. We have covert action that's going on in the region. And the State Department has to be able to quarterback both the overt and covert roles. And those covert roles are delegated to the Central Intelligence Agency with support from the Pentagon. So we created a censorship capacity within the U.S. government in the State Department in 2014 through something called the Global Engagement Center, engaging globally in the tech space, initially under a national security predicate around the time that ISIS was said to be recruiting on Facebook and Twitter. This was supposedly this novel threat on social media that ISIS was on the rise and they were recruiting impressionable young Americans. This was, we had the first homegrown ISIS attack, Garland, Texas, if you remember,
Yes.
2015. And, there's a lot of strangeness about that event, by the way, that came out that I'll just leave as an aside. But essentially, the State Department was permitted to be able to liaise with Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and all the other platforms to advise them on the different accounts that they should censor and take down, the different narratives that should be suppressed, the different keyword databases that should be algorithmically throttled, because they were leveraging a DARPA technology. It was called natural language processing. There had been hundreds of millions of dollars poured into the R&D on this AI censorship technique, which involved network mapping social media interlinkages. So you may have seen, for example, just in the news or in various reports, what some of these social media network graphs look like, where it'll have a circle and it'll have someone's name on it, someone's account, and then it'll have a line to 3 different circles that person connects to, and those will all have lines to 10 other accounts that they connect to, and it'll look like a big spherical ball with nodes and links that describe the social media network map of a particular movement. Now, at the time, this was developed by the Pentagon for use by the State Department to be able to then tell the social media platforms, everyone in this network gets nuked. That was 2014 to 2016. The problem was when the foreign policy establishment decided and declared effectively this from tanks to tweets doctrine. This was the NATO doctrine. They formerly called this from tanks to tweets, that NATO was extending its mandate from tanks to tweets. And when that was set in motion, that technique of network mapping narratives and terrorist groups was then set about on political groups and domestic political groups, populist groups in Europe and the Trump movement here in the US. So it's really not so much about conservatives and the GOP, because there's a civil war that broke out with the 2016 election. It's important to keep this in mind. Trump did not just defeat Hillary Clinton. He didn't defeat just the Clinton dynasty. He defeated the Bush dynasty. And the Bush dynasty had been the dynasty, that had lorded over the GOP for multiple Bushes, right? I mean, we had 8 years of George W. We had basically 12 years of George Sr., because not only was he the president of the United States from 88 to 92, he was the vice president from 1980 to 1988, and he was the CIA director before that. And this foreign policy, and what was he doing at the CIA before he was the CIA director? He was the CIA oil intelligence liaison to Latin America and to Saudi Arabia. So there's this GOP power base extending from the military, the energy, to the Chamber of Commerce spheres that the populist right went to war with when populist nationalist conservatives rallied around Trump and said, we care more about America first than about essentially what we're doing around the world and what the rest of the world is doing. Now, at the time, they didn't really understand the tripwire they were setting off, which was how much of a threat that concept of focusing on domestic priorities over foreign policy truly represented, which is why there became an immediate alliance between the Bush blob wing of the foreign policy. Now, the blob is the sort of the Obama administration's moniker for the foreign policy establishment. So if you hear me use that term, that's what blob means. It just means the foreign policy establishment. Okay. But so what happened is, for example, the groups that were the primary consensus builders for how to establish a government role in U.S. censorship, because they recognized the size of the task, that this would involve what they call the whole of society effort that would tie together 4 different categories of institutions: government institutions, private sector institutions like the social media platforms, civil society institutions, which is the NGO swarm army, the university centers, the nonprofits, the foundations, and all the different community and activist groups they need to onboard, as well as the media institutions. So again, whole of society means 4 different categories: government, private sector, civil society, and media. And what they said early on in their own internal meetings, which I've clipped a million times and is all over my Twitter account, is they constructed this idea that in order to get a whole society in motion, they need to have a government quarterback. They wouldn't, the Stanford Internet Observatory, one of the main universities associated with the censorship apparatus, it doesn't have the clout on its own to go into a $1 trillion corporation like Google and tell them what policies to do. They can't just march into the media and get news cycles there. But they're very good at, network mapping and being able to do some of the technical, construction of that sphere, for example, that they want Google to censor and Facebook and YouTube. They all have their own roles, but that quarterback role, only the government would have the clout to be able to do that herding of cats process. So in early 2017, they set about in these stakeholder meetings a question of how they could actually pull this off within the U.S. government, given that there is a First Amendment and given the restrictions on the foreign policy establishment institutions that they had under their control. So they were contemplating, well, the best place would be the State Department's Global Engagement Center. We already have the network there, but they said, oh, that's foreign facing. We couldn't really park it there. So then they considered parking it at the Central Intelligence Agency. But not only does that have a foreign facing predicate, and you can't just sic the CIA on domestic tweets about mail-in ballots, but also doing this as a clandestine operation is very, very difficult. In the 1980s, the intelligence community developed a technique for using front companies and public-facing NGOs to serve as the liaison point to be able to greatly expand the scale of a clandestine action. Because if you are, say, running a color revolution and you need hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets in order to overthrow their government, for example, with the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia, and this is our tried and true tactic. You do need hundreds of thousands of people involved. Those people can't all have security clearances. Those people can't, all have top secret, special compartmentalized information, buy-in on a need-to-know basis about their particular role in it. So these pro-democracy groups and these pro-democracy NGOs popped up and were capacity built by taxpayer-funded State Department funds to be able to create these pro-democracy NGOs that would serve to, as a sort of open sourcing of what at root was a CIA or State Department, classified initiative. So in this case, they said, well, we can't really make this in a classical sort of intelligence type thing because it's going to involve Facebook, Google, Twitter, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Poynter Institute fact-checking network. It's going to involve all these. So we need it to sort of be above. So they said, we can't do it as a CIA thing. They said, well, the FBI would be a great place to park this because the FBI has it is a domestic intelligence agency. But the issue is the FBI is the intelligence arm of the Justice Department. And what we're targeting here is not law breaking. It's not illegal to tweet, about your support for Donald Trump. So they said there's only one other domestic intelligence equity in the U.S. We have 17 intelligence agencies. Only 2 of them are domestic. The other one is DHS. So they said, perfect. DHS we can do a really cute thing out of DHS, which is we can combine the foreign-facing classical type of media control activities that are delegated to the CIA with the domestic jurisdiction of the FBI, because DHS is not attached to the Justice Department. It's its own independent intelligence agency. And so in 2018, they established an office within DHS called CISA. Now they didn't call it the censorship agency. They did a very, very dirty trick that frankly they should never be forgiven for. And frankly, they should be wholly disbanded on the basis of, because it's one of the craziest scandals in American history. What they did is by giving themselves this dull, boring name, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which its founder, Chris Krebs, said, we call it that because we just care so much about security, we put it in our name twice. It had nothing to do with that. What they did is they said, because at the time there was no offensive capability in the online realm to be able to censor. The only cyber capacity that had any legitimacy, that had any funding, that had any legal mandate in this country was cybersecurity. That was all you could do online as a government agency. That was the only offensive action you could take. So they said, well, we can't just call it the censorship agency. We're going to call this cybersecurity, but we're going to do a couple of cute things in the definition in order to get away with it. We're going to say that dis, and malinformation on social media is a cybersecurity attack on U.S. critical infrastructure. It's cyber because it's online, the social media posts, and critical infrastructure. Our elections are critical infrastructure. Public health, so we can censor whatever you say in an election cycle. Public health is critical infrastructure, so we can censor whatever you say about COVID-19. Do you oppose vaccines? Do you oppose masks? Do you oppose mandates? Are you casting conspiracy theories on Tony Fauci that undermine public faith and confidence in our public health regime? Well, that's an attack on that's a cyber attack on the critical infrastructure of our public health. So they did this with every issue, and it ballooned into saying, well, if you talk about the open border, well, now you're jeopardizing. This is a cyber threat to U.S. critical infrastructure on immigration issues, on energy issues, on the Ukraine war. It became this El Dorado gold mine, a God button to be able to control the rise and fall of political movements. And so it started at DHS. And when DHS got away with it for 4 straight years, from 2018 to 2022, they got overconfident and they started being more and more explicit about it. And this is where they rolled out the Disinformation Governance Board. And if you remember at the time, they were saying, well, it's not the censorship agency. And that's true. It was not the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Truth was CISA, but CISA and the other DHS, it's called INA, Intelligence Analysis. The other intelligence equities at DHS had sprawled and spawned into such a leviathan monster with so many touch points into so many different whole of society actors that by 2022 they needed a management board for the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Truth that had already existed for 4 years there. That's what the Disinformation Governance Board was, by the way. Anyway, but by that point, the whole of society expanded to whole of government. So the FBI set up censorship offices, the State Department, the Pentagon, the National Science Foundation, issue by issue, HHS did, FDA did. It became something that was said to be necessary to censor social media in the name of democracy, which is basically a CIA watchword for regime change of a government. So I know that's a lot there, and I'll just stop.
Yeah, yeah. This is like a fire hose. A couple of things. Number one, everything you just said, you just described my entire channel, which leads me to believe I'm probably being censored and monitored by the government because of the topics I cover. And number two, wasn't Chris Krebs and CISA the group and the person that said the 2020 election was the most safe and secure election in American history?
Yes, and there's a lot of nastiness there, because think about the conflict of interest there. On January 6, 2017, the last act of Obama's outgoing DHS Secretary, Jed Johnson, was to federalize national elections and put their administration in the hands of DHS. This is the executive order passed 2 weeks before Trump was inaugurated. And then tragically, the Trump administration ratified that order under John Kelly in March 2017, even though all 50 states had opposed it because it was usurping the traditional independence the states have over their independent administration of elections. But DHS was basically given federal control over election administration. And they were the ones who were supposed to be safeguarding the U.S. from election fraud. And they were simultaneously put in charge of censorship of tens of millions of tweets and YouTube videos and Facebook posts, Discord, Twitch. They went after 15 different social media platforms. By their own math, 22 million tweets were targeted for censorship under CISA just in the 5 months lead up to the 2020 election. 22 million. That's just tweets alone, and then add in all the 14 other platforms, which included major forums like Reddit. So the same agency that was supposed to be guarding the hen house was the executioner of anyone who had questions about about what happened inside the hen house, so to speak. Now, this is particularly nasty because what CISA, what DHS did, what Chris Krebs's office did is they wrung the necks and threatened government pressure and crisis PR and advertiser boycotts, using essentially this whole society model as the threat behind it on all the tech platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And they sent these attack dogs called the Election Integrity Partnership on them, as well as many others that I can get into if you're curious for more detail, to threaten them to all in lockstep install a brand new terms of service violation policy in the run-up to 2020 called delegitimization. So, and what delegitimization meant is that any information that anyone posted on social media for 5 months in the run-up to the 2020 election that delegitimized a hypothetical upcoming red mirage blue shift event. That is an event where Trump appeared to win on election day, the red mirage, but it would shift blue in the subsequent days because of mail-in ballots. They knew that would look illegitimate. Nothing like that had ever happened in this country. This country's never used mass mail-in ballots like that. It had been a contentious issue since the Civil War in 1862. It was an election, an election year scandal around mail-in ballots. The Democrats had been highly, opposing them for years, but then suddenly that became the way that we were going to vote, starting basically in between April and June 2020. And what DHS did is they said, well, listen, if Biden's going to win, it's going to be through this red mirage blue shift. It's going to look really, really fishy at the time. And the perceptions of illegitimacy are going to be a nightmare to litigate. It's going to be a nightmare, a shadow hanging over the Biden government. It's going to, what happens in that intermonth period, if there is a crisis sense of perceived illegitimacy, is going to potentially get out of our control. And they know this because the foreign policy establishment's job is to induce election crises when it orchestrates color revolutions abroad. When we say, Lukashenko didn't really win the election, even though he got 85% of the vote on paper, we declared our CIA-backed candidate during the summer of 2020 in Belarus. We said, oh, our candidate actually won, and then we used our NGO blob, our swarm army, our paid army to take to the streets to try to overthrow the government. This is how we overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. Illegitimate government, take to the streets, yada, yada. So what they did is they pre-censored 5 months ahead of the 2020 election any social media post that quote delegitimized the idea of mail-in ballots not being safe and secure, that delegitimized the leaving early voting drop boxes open for 6 to 8 months, that delegitimized any questions about the administration of electronic voting machines, that delegitimized any questions about ballot tabulation issues. So the same DHS nucleus, which was staffed to the gills with CIA and NSA and DOD folks, that was basically the mind creation of the foreign policy establishment's response to losing the 2016 election, was put in charge of the technical administration of the voting machines, the technical administration of the 50 state sort of administration of the election, and protecting the legitimacy at and administering the legitimacy at the technical level, were in charge of censoring any questions about their administration of the election. I mean, that is the perfect, blank check for stealing an election that you could ever conceive of. So I'm not as technically versed on what happened. There's a lot of open questions on the technical fraud issues. So but my domain is on the censorship one, but there's so much smoke from the censorship side that let's just say it begs a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, even now, I was told through Facebook that anything that I put up about the election might be taken down between now and November, that they're not going to boost any posts about politics. And now they do this in countries around the world. Then you have Mark Zuckerberg randomly handing over $400 million, and most of that ends up, and over 90% of it ends up in the hands of people getting Joe Biden elected. So there's just like, and the COVID thing, none of us were allowed to openly talk about COVID, have no opinion on COVID. If you wanted to, promote something that fit the narrative, it's almost like you would be boosted. But I had videos that were demonetized. I had videos that I can see right in the analytics that they didn't show me to people. And like, there's nothing I can do about it except for just in my heart know that I'm being screwed over because they're trying to control the truth that I'm able to share with my audience.
Yeah. The government put its boot on the neck of the tech platforms to do that. And the wing of the government is the nastiest wing. It's the sections of the US government that for 80 years in this country has had a license to do crimes, a license to do dirty tricks, a license to rig elections, a license to rig media. This is, the foreign policy establishment is able to do that to foreign countries. And essentially after the 2016 election, they simply imported it here. And that was exactly those sections that did that for COVID censorship. So, a great example of this is who was it who was doing this network mapping for misinformation communities and getting the social media companies to take that all down? Well, one of the chief actors in the space was a group called the Virality Project, which was literally the second name of the Election Integrity Partnership. It's the same institutions. Stanford University's the Stanford Internet Observatory, which was the technical operations there came from the CIA. And the head of the department was Obama's State Department ambassador to Russia. Just to you understand how these ops are interconnected. The University of Washington Center for Informed Public, which was run by someone who basically had serviced the Pentagon for social media network mapping, for crisis informatics for the whole career there. It was the Atlantic Council, which has 7 CIA directors on its board and gets annual funding every year from the Pentagon, the State Department, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. And it was Graphica. And Graphica has gotten $7 million in Pentagon contracts. They do social media network mapping for the Pentagon to be able to suppress the rise of insurgent groups in places where the Pentagon's operating. And they came straight out of the Minerva Initiative, which is the Pentagon's Psychological Warfare Research Center. So you literally had all 4 of these institutions were CIA, Pentagon, State Department controlled civil society cutouts. And, it begs a lot of questions about the role of those same agencies in the COVID origin story. There's a lot of very strange aspects of the role of the DoD and CIA in the COVID origin story. Avril Haines, for example, was one of the stars of Event 201, which was the simulation jointly held by the Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is a huge attaché at the university level of the Defense Department, and it's jointly held by them, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it brought together the head of Chinese intelligence. It brought together Avril Haines, who at the time was deputy director of the CIA under Obama, and she's now the boss of bosses at the CIA. As she's the ODN, she's the director of national intelligence. So, what she was doing at a coronavirus simulator with a segment on how to censor social media conspiracy theories about the outbreak of a China-based bat coronavirus in October 2019, just 2 months before said virus from said region, from said origins. What was the CIA director doing? Coordinating a whole of society censorship response to the outbreak of a virus that wouldn't break out for 60 more days. What was USAID, which is one of the classic conduits for CIA clandestine activity? Why was USAID giving a $53 million grant to the Wuhan lab? What was DARPA doing funding the sub technology for the spike protein virus that ends up being the main thing that gives COVID its damage? What was the Rocky Mountain Laboratory doing, as the precursor conduit to that, when the Rocky Mountain Laboratory was basically, there's a lot of credible evidence around that very same lab in Montana having a very strong role in the construction of tick-borne viruses that were souped up through gain of function and deployed on Cuba in the 1960s and in the Korean War in the 1950s. I mean, the Pentagon fingerprints over the COVID origin story looks very bad when you see that actually the censorship of COVID came from them as well. It looks like they're covering up their own crimes. And just one last thing I'll say on that: who were the first movers of COVID? What were the very first institutions to censor COVID origins? Graphica, this firm I just described to you, chief strategy officer, 25 years in the CIA, $7 million of Pentagon funding coming into COVID. And they literally were formerly in-house at the Pentagon Psychological Warfare Research Center. This same firm began writing white papers and memos and doing work to censor social media narratives about COVID origins on December 16th, 2019. That's just 4 days after the pneumonia-like symptoms broke out. Now, when I broke that story, they responded and said, actually, we started in January 2020. We had a 30-day look back. Now, they didn't provide any receipts on that, but that's still, even by their own words, this was before coronavirus was even called, it wasn't even called COVID-19 yet. It hadn't come to America yet. This was still just 1 month then. Within 1 month, the Pentagon's Psychological Operations Warfare Unit is deployed to create these vast, sprawling network maps of who on social media is asking inconvenient questions about a lab origin. What the hell is the Pentagon PSYOP Center doing, deployed like a white blood cell to censor First Amendment protected speech by the citizens funding the Pentagon about what the Pentagon was really doing?
You're blowing my mind. I know, I know you have to jump on to another interview, but yeah, go ahead. I was
going to say, and you know who Graphica was partnered with on that? The NATO Center of Excellence, which was the exact hybrid warfare group set up. Remember when I told you when NATO declared the tanks to tweets doctrine? Well, and they set down all this censorship institutional infrastructure to coordinate with Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all those private sector tech social media companies after the Crimea annexation in 2014. They set down all these centers of excellence across NATO. Well, Graphic was partnered with the NATO Center of Excellence, when it was doing this work. And this is and again, that was a psychological warfare. The Center of Excellence, the Center of Excellence in strategic communications, in control over the communications infrastructure in NATO countries. It was explicitly set up as a censorship center to be able to censor Russian propaganda over hearts and minds in Eastern Europe so that we could fold them into NATO. But that exact same PSYOPs center for the Ukraine war and for controlling the fate of elections in European parliamentary elections to stop the rise of populist groups, those are the same centers running COVID, the military centers.
Oh my gosh. Okay. We're going to have you back on, Mike. I know you've got to jump. I only got to 2 of my 8 questions, but this has been mind blowing. I hope my audience appreciates all the research you've done. If Trump can get back into the White House, are you going to be a part of his administration?
We'll see. My role is, as a political appointee, what they're doing to Trump is absolutely criminal, and history will remember. Hopefully there'll be accountability for what's been done. I consider myself to be fundamentally apolitical on this, and that my job is to fight for the principles of free speech on the internet, and my foundation for freedom online. So everyone, the best place to follow me is on Twitter, at X, at Mike Ben Cyber. That's all one word, at Mike Ben Cyber. Also have a Rumble channel, Mike Ben Cyber. I'm highly active there. If you want my daily thoughts on all of this and all the receipts and stories that I post, just at Mike Ben Cyber on Twitter.
Okay, I'll put that down. I know you got to get on to another show. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.